The stage lights burned hot, cameras zeroed in, and the air felt like crackling static before a lightning storm. The moderator's question was barely out when Ron DeSantis leaned forward, his voice sharp, aiming for the jugular. With a smirk carved across his face, he fired a line meant to wound not just Kamala Harris but the millions who see themselves reflected in her story. He branded her unfit, dismissing her heritage, her experience, and her right to claim the American promise. The crowd gasped. Some cheered, but many shifted uncomfortably, stunned that a man on a national stage could drip so much disdain in a single breath. For a fleeting second, it felt as though the insult hung heavy in the air, pressing down on the room itself. The cameras panned to Kamala, stone still, eyes fixed forward, steady as granite. It was the silence before the counterpunch, the anticipation before the storm. DeSantis, reveling in the venom of his words, mistook that silence for victory. He didn't see it. The growing unease flickering across the audience, the shifting expressions, the recognition that something bigger was about to erupt. And then, a ripple. A woman in the crowd shook her head, muttering audibly enough for a nearby mic to catch. "That's enough." The audience stirred, sensing a breaking point. Millions at home leaned closer to their screens. What happens when arrogance collides with dignity? What happens when a man intoxicated by his own bravado believes he's already won, before the real fight has even begun? The answer wasn't far away, because in the next breath, Kamala prepared to speak. And what she delivered would ignite the arena, flip the narrative, and leave Ron DeSantis scrambling. But the opening blow was his, and it may have been the costliest mistake of his career. The sting of DeSantis's words was not just about Kamala Harris. It cut deeper, striking at something every immigrant family, every daughter of strivers, every voice long told to wait your turn has felt in America. His jab was not just an insult aimed across the stage. It was a challenge to the very idea of belonging. That's why the crowd's silence was so tense, why millions at home leaned in. Because for them, this wasn't about two politicians trading sound bites. This was about whether dignity would stand taller than disdain. Kamala's pause in that moment wasn't hesitation. It was restraint. It was the poise of someone who grew up learning that silence can sometimes roar louder than noise, that patience has its own gravity, and that patience stood in sharp relief against DeSantis, the man who thrives on interrupting, doubling down, sneering. Every second she waited, the imbalance grew. The audience could feel it. Something rare in politics was underway. A test of character, not just policy. But this battle mattered for more than the theater of one night. To progressive Americans, to immigrant families sitting around their televisions, to every young voter who doubts that the system sees them, it mattered because it starkly asked, who gets to claim America? Who embodies its values? Who understands that the nation is stitched together not by purity tests of identity, but by shared ideals of opportunity and fairness? And while DeSantis played to a base hungry for exclusion, it risked backfiring in spectacular fashion. Because within the confrontation, a mirror appeared. Voters watching were not just sizing up the candidates, they were sizing up the country itself. Would arrogance define America's face, or would resilience finally answer back? The stakes unfurled beyond the stage. Newsrooms braced for clips that would dominate morning headlines. Campaign strategists on both sides recognized this exchange could alter momentum, shift undecideds, galvanize, or fracture coalitions. The confrontation wasn't just about words. It was about trajectory. At that precise moment, no one in the room could fully predict what Kamala was about to unleash, but the electricity in the air practically hummed like a warning. Everyone knew the next word she spoke had the power to change the mood of the debate, the headlines by dawn, and possibly the very shape of the campaign. And as she finally drew in that breath to speak, the hush breaking, cameras zooming closer, the question hung suspensefully for millions watching. What happens next changes everything. To truly grasp the weight of what unfolded on that debate stage, you have to step back and examine the man behind the smirk. Ron DeSantis was not just another candidate taking potshots at an opponent. He carried on his shoulders a reputation built as much on bravado as on contradiction. His rise in politics had always been tethered to an image. Sharp, uncompromising, the warrior who would bulldoze through anything deemed woke. Admired by some as unyielding, feared by others as merciless, DeSantis positioned himself as the self-anointed guardian of traditional America. Yet peel back that carefully woven costume, and the threads of hypocrisy begin to show. This is the man who preached freedom while signing laws that censored teachers. The man who claimed to champion liberty while restricting women's rights, book access, and even conversations about identity in classrooms. To his supporters, it was righteous firmness. To his critics, it was insecurity masquerading as strength. DeSantis often spoke as if America were fragile, at risk from ideas, from books, from diversity itself. But was a nation supposedly strong, enough to dominate the world truly so fragile that it trembled before the existence of different voices? That was the contradiction he never could reconcile. Arrogance propelled him. DeSantis believed debates were arenas where he could rattle opponents through intimidation. An eye roll here, a sharp taunt there, a performative laugh that belittled rather than built. His strategy wasn't persuasion, it was domination. Yet, time and again, what he failed to grasp is that domination works only as long as your opponent plays by your script. The moment someone refuses to be belittled, the bully's playbook crumbles. In his rise to governorship, he projected himself as an everyman, but his policies revealed a widening gulf between image and action. He framed immigration as a threat, shipping vulnerable families across state lines like pawns, while his own narrative rested on stories of hard work and grit. He brandished his military service as proof of patriotism, yet weaponized division on the home front, undermining the very unity he once swore to protect. Hypocrisy shadowed him like an unspoken chorus, loud enough to be heard by those paying attention, quiet enough for his most fervent supporters to ignore. Still, for years, arrogance shielded him from reckoning. Crowds cheered when he drew sharp lines. Media headlines rarely outpaced his next calculated outrage. The tactic was simple. Stay aggressive, never apologize, project confidence at all costs. That armor carried him far, until he stepped onto the stage opposite someone unwilling to flinch. Because the other thing about arrogance is this: it blinds. DeSantis had rehearsed his barbs believing Kamala Harris would play a predictable part. In his script, a defensive stumble, a frustrated rebuttal, a moment of visible irritation. That's what he wanted. That's what his team banked on. But arrogance makes you deaf to nuance, blind to shifts in the atmosphere, numb to the ripple before the wave. As he leaned harder into condescension, he missed the growing disconnect with the very audience whose approval he sought. This wasn't just another politician sparring in scripted lines. This was a man so sure of his own invincibility that he stepped into a battle unprepared for resistance. History has shown us time and again, arrogance breeds overconfidence, and overconfidence births collapse. On that stage, Ron DeSantis was walking the well-trodden path of men who mistake volume for power, disdain for dominance, and cruelty for toughness, and without knowing it, he was already setting up the conditions for his own undoing. Because every insult he hurled at Kamala Harris wasn't merely ammunition, it was the rope with which his performance would hang itself. And the audience was just beginning to notice. To understand the force Kamala Harris carried into that debate stage, you have to journey through the soil of her beginnings, the kind of story that isn't polished in gilded halls or inherited from dynasties, but carved from struggle, resilience, and the stubborn insistence on belonging. She was born in Oakland, California, the daughter of immigrants whose very union embodied a radical idea that love and intellect could travel across oceans, collide in America, and build something new. Her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, left India armed with little more than courage, curiosity, and a fierce belief that education could crack open ceilings. She pursued a doctorate in endocrinology, studying cancer at a time when women in labs were often treated as intruders. Kamala's father, Donald Harris, left Jamaica to chase the promise of academia, carving a path in economics. Together, they taught their daughters not just equations or theorems, but something even more enduring, that identity is never a limitation, only a foundation. Kamala's childhood was one of constant negotiation, between cultures, between expectations, between a society that still whispered "not quite" to girls who carried brown skin and an immigrant surname. She learned early what it meant to navigate spaces that weren't built for her, classrooms where she was one of the only children of color, neighborhoods where her mother's accent drew stares, and a nation where belonging required daily affirmation. But struggle carried lessons that privilege rarely teaches. In every dismissal, she heard an echo. Prove them wrong. In every barrier, an invitation. Climb higher. When she spoke about justice later in life, it wasn't theoretical. It was personal. It was the memory of her mother bending down, staring her young daughter in the eye and saying, "Don't sit around and complain about things. Do something." It was the image of neighbors organizing in churches to march for civil rights, teaching Kamala that movements begin small, with people who refuse to give up. Those values carried her into Howard University, affectionately known as the Mecca. There she was surrounded by peers who celebrated identity, not as baggage, but as power. At Howard, she honed a voice that could rise above noise, sharpen through debate, and land with conviction. She studied political science and economics not to coast into comfort, but to prepare for service. As part of Howard's debated clubs and student groups, she learned the energy of sparring ideas, the importance of listening before speaking, and the necessity of commanding both intellect and presence, traits that, years later, would steel her spine against men like Ron DeSantis who mistook volume for authority. Her path into law, becoming a prosecutor and later the Attorney General of California, was riddled with paradox. Critics pounced. Supporters rallied, but behind every choice was the same compass: to be at the table where decisions were made, to represent communities otherwise ignored. She faced skepticism at almost every rung. Too ambitious, they said, not prepared. Ambition, in their eyes, was framed as arrogance because she was a woman of color, daring to claim terrain others assumed was not meant for her. Yet, she persisted. Again, the lesson from childhood played on repeat. Prove them wrong. Her career rose, but her battles remained grueling, confronting systemic inequities, navigating the good old boy networks, walking into rooms where she was doubted, before she even opened her mouth. And yet she turned that doubt into fuel. The courtroom became her arena, where she learned how to dismantle contradictions, layer logic with passion, and strike with precision at the weak seams of an opponent's argument. So when she stood across from Ron DeSantis, she carried not just preparation, but a lifetime of resilience sharpened into skill. She knew the difference between arrogance and confidence. She had seen men like him before, men sure of their own dominance, men who used sneers as substitutes for substance. His mockery of her heritage, his dismissal of her credibility, his smirk designed to reduce. None of that was new. What he didn't know was that every slight she endured growing up, every doubt cast along her path, had been quiet training for moments like this. And America, watching at home, they weren't just seeing a politician on stage, they were witnessing a daughter of immigrants answering a question larger than any moderator could ask. Will the voices that once stood on the margins finally command the center? Kamala Harris embodied not perfection, but persistence, not pedigree, but perseverance. She carried her mother's words, her community's hopes, and the belief that dignity is itself a weapon. That night, dignity was about to meet disdain head-on, and though the sparks had only just begun to fly, the storm of this clash was already inevitable. Because Kamala Harris's journey was never about surviving arrogance, it was about defeating it. The initial exchange had already tilted the room, but what followed was the slow ignition of something far more combustible. DeSantis, sensing the audience drifting, tried to lurch back into control the only way he knew how, by doubling down. He cut off the moderator, leaning over his lectern with that trademark scowl, and fired volley after volley. She's weak on crime. She doesn't understand real America. She's a phony, a radical, dressed up in a smile. His voice grew harder, sharper, each word designed not to persuade, but to humiliate. The crowd stirred uneasily, their murmurs swelling like a rising tide. Some clapped at his punches, but it wasn't the crisp applause of conviction. It was jagged, forced, already beginning to fray. He didn't notice. DeSantis was locked into overdrive, mistaking louder for stronger, mistaking sneers for points, and, through it all, Kamala Harris stood still, her face a portrait of calm resolve. She didn't bite on the interruptions. She didn't recoil at the insults. Instead, she waited. She collected each barb, each interruption like stones being stacked, until the pile became heavy enough to collapse under its own weight. The silence she held was louder than his shouting, the composure more cutting than his derision. Viewers at home saw it clearly. His sweat under the lights, his jaw tightening when the applause he expected didn't come, the forced grin that couldn't mask irritation. With every insult, DeSantis sought to rattle her, but the only person crumbling was himself. His body language betrayed him. Gestures too sharp, eyes darting nervously toward the crowd as though begging for reassurance. Kamala finally raised her hand gently, not as a demand, but as a signal. The moderator leaned in, granting her the floor. And in that moment, the room itself seemed to exhale, as though everyone had been holding their breath waiting for her to respond. The crowd leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. She began measured, not matching vitriol with vitriol, but steady, deliberate. Each word rolled with the kind of weight born from conviction, not theater. "You know," she said, her tone calm, yet piercing. "When someone spends more time name-calling than explaining their policies, it tells you everything you need to know about what they're afraid of." The remark landed with precision, slicing through the noise. Gasps followed. Then, cheers swelling like thunder hitting the walls. DeSantis tried to cut her off again, but the momentum had shifted. For the first time that night, the crowd wasn't with him. They were against him. Every interruption now sounded desperate. Every insult revealed panic. Kamala, unflinching, let him talk over himself until his anger became a caricature. The contrast could not have been starker. Arrogance fraying into bitterness on one side, composure hardening into strength on the other. By now, the stage was no longer neutral ground. It had become a trial. One candidate stood indicted by his own bluster, the other prepared to deliver the verdict. And though the climax hadn't yet arrived, you could feel the anticipation vibrating in the air. The debate had escalated into a collision course. Everyone watching could sense it. The next exchange would not simply be words, it would be the moment that tipped the entire night. And as DeSantis grew louder, hungrier, more frantic, Kamala Harris, readying herself in silence, felt all the more dangerous. Her counterpunch was coming, and when it landed, it would leave no doubt who truly owned the stage. The moment had been building, each insult stacking like tinder, waiting for a single spark. DeSantis was still mid-rant, his voice growing louder and harsher, when Kamala Harris finally leaned forward. Her posture shifted ever so slightly, but it was enough. The audience felt it before they even knew it. This was the moment she had been holding back, the moment she was about to take control. She let him finish one more tirade, then with surgical calm, she slid in. Her voice wasn't raised, her tone wasn't frantic. It was steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of certainty. "Governor," she began, pausing just long enough to freeze the room, "you seem to believe that yelling makes you right. But let me remind you, Americans don't measure strength by volume. We measure it by vision, by values, and by who we fight for." The line struck like a thunderclap. The audience erupted, a roar so loud that the cameras shook in their frames. DeSantis raised his voice above the cheers, repeating the same accusations, but they dissolved into the background. His words were swallowed by the sound of people clapping and standing, the irresistible rhythm of momentum slipping away from him. Kamala didn't stop there. She pressed. "You talk about freedom. But under your watch, freedom is only for the few, for those who look like you, think like you, and worship like you. Let me be crystal clear. Freedom in this country belongs to all of us. Immigrants, women, students, workers, people of every race and identity. We are the real America you pretend doesn't exist." Gasps again, then cheers, chants, a crowd in motion. A chant of "Kamala, Kamala" rippled through sections of the hall, amplifying her words in a way no microphone could. DeSantis's jaw visibly tightened, his smirk replaced by the flat glare of someone losing command. She turned to the camera, cutting through the stage and speaking not to her opponent, but directly into the homes of millions. "Governor DeSantis says I'm unfit, but the truth is, it's un-American to fear diversity, to divide people for politics, to sneer at the kids of immigrants and tell them they don't belong. My story isn't just my story. It's the American story, and no amount of shouting will erase it." The effect was seismic. Online, hashtags began trending instantly. In the debate hall, people stood on their feet. Some clapped through tears. Others shouted as though they were at a rally rather than a debate. Even the moderator looked momentarily stunned, eyes shifting between the rival candidates as if silently acknowledging that something historic had just shifted. DeSantis tried to recover with another interruption, snapping his rebuttal into the microphone. But the more he spoke, the smaller he seemed. His movements turned stiff, his attempts at cutting humor fell flat, and the crowd's reaction betrayed him. His own words echoed against applause for hers, the contrast humiliating in its clarity. Kamala, now fully in rhythm, continued to peel back his contradictions with precision. "You say you want to protect kids, but what you protect them from are books, not bullets. You say you believe in freedom, but your vision of freedom stops the moment it meets a woman's right to choose. You say you love this country, but all we hear are ways you want to shut its doors to people who remind you of me, of my parents, of millions out there watching tonight." Every sentence landed. Clean, powerful, undeniable. She didn't need anger, she didn't need to shout. Confidence and conviction wrapped every word. The more she spoke, the more DeSantis shrank, reduced to shaking his head and scribbling furious notes that he'd never get the chance to use. The crowd hung on her cadence as though she conducted an orchestra, tension rising, release flooding, then rising again. By the time she delivered the final blow, the atmosphere was electric. You can try to erase people, you can try to silence them, you can even try to mock them on this stage. But the problem for you, Governor, is this. America doesn't belong to bullies. America belongs to the people, all of the people, and we are not going anywhere. The auditorium erupted. This wasn't applause. It was an explosion, a tidal wave rising from the pit of the hall to the rafters. People were on their feet, the sound deafening, some shaking their heads in awe, others chanting, voices blending into one collective cry, for dignity over disdain. DeSantis's lips moved as though he wanted to reply, but his words were drowned, utterly eclipsed by the noise. The camera caught him in stark relief, face rigid, eyes darting, not the look of a victor, but of someone suddenly aware that history was turning against him. And Kamala. She stood calmly, her hands resting on the podium, allowing the applause to flow through her like vindication. She had no need to gloat, no need to add more. Her silence was now her roar. It was the silence of someone who knew she had just reshaped the narrative, live, before the eyes of a nation. When the moderator struggled to regain order, the damage was done. Commentators would later call it the moment, the defining flash that split arrogance from authenticity and revealed the difference for everyone to see. That mic drop counterattack wasn't only a debate victory, it was a cultural earthquake. And in its aftershock, DeSantis stood exposed, not as the warrior he fancied himself, but as a man overpowered by a woman's poise, heritage, and clarity. But the story didn't end with the arena's eruption. What came after would ripple outward, across social media, through news headlines into living rooms and conversations, the kind of shockwave that no strategist could script, no spin could contain. And by morning, the nation would not be talking about DeSantis's insults. They would be talking about Kamala Harris's dismantling of them. The final echoes of applause still rattled inside the debate hall when the aftershocks began radiating across America. Within minutes, phones glowed like constellations as millions clipped, tweeted, and shared Kamala Harris's takedown. Hashtags mushroomed across platforms before the moderators had even moved to the next segment. America belongs to all of us trended globally, followed closely by Kamala Mic Drop and Debate of the Year. Twitter feeds pulsed with gifs of DeSantis's stunned expression, frozen in mid-scowl, juxtaposed next to Kamala's calm gaze at the camera. Clips spread from living rooms to newsrooms in real time. Anchors who usually parse debates cautiously spoke in almost cinematic terms. That was not rhetoric, that was an earthquake. Overnight, major outlets pivoted headlines. Harris seizes debate stage, read one. DeSantis outshouted by applause, read another. Even publications known for restraint acknowledged it. A definitive moment had unfolded. On TikTok, young creators spliced Kamala's words with cultural anthems, turning her speech into a rallying cry for a new generation. Teens posted videos of themselves repeating her lines with pride, each clip carrying a tone of ownership. This is our America too. Immigrant families uploaded heartfelt reactions, parents pointing to the screen, telling their children, "Listen, that's why we keep fighting." For many, this wasn't just about politics. It was personal validation, the rare moment when someone in power seemed to tell their story back to them. Memes exploded too. One showed DeSantis shouting into a void, swallowed by the word applause. Another looped Kamala's line about books and bullets, each replay punctuated by drum beats, hammering the point home like an anthem. What might have been dismissed as a mere debate clip hardened overnight into cultural currency. The shockwaves weren't confined to social feeds. In community centers, restaurants, offices, people replayed the moment on their phones, passing devices across tables to make sure others didn't miss it. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms the next morning, using it as a springboard for discussions about freedom, inclusion, and the power of words. Somewhere, a middle school student, hearing Kamala say, "America doesn't belong to bullies," felt taller, more certain, more visible. Somewhere else, an exhausted immigrant worker felt, if only for a moment, that the nation's story made room for them too. Meanwhile, DeSantis's camp scrambled. On conservative corners of the internet, supporters tried to reframe the exchange, but the effort stumbled against the tidal force of the clip itself. His rebuttals sounded flat when replayed side by side with her thunderous moment. Even some of his allies admitted sotto voce to reporters. He looked rattled. That wasn't the plan. Pundits debated policy specifics, fact-checked details, parsed the data points. But most viewers didn't remember statistics. They remembered energy. They remembered how one candidate raged and faltered while the other absorbed, countered, and stood tall. They remembered how the crowd sounded like it was no longer a debate audience but a movement in full voice. And in politics, perception often swallows precision whole. By dawn, the ripple reached international news desks. Newspapers abroad described Harris's remarks as a rebuke to nationalism and a spotlight on American pluralism. For communities far from U.S. borders, her words still mattered, because the question of who counts as belonging in America reverberates into the global imagination. The debate stage had been a theater for policy, but its aftermath transformed into something more visceral, a nationwide conversation about dignity, about who defines freedom, about whether inclusion is strength or weakness, and the resonance was clear. People desperately wanted it to be strength. But the real measure of a moment isn't just cheers in a hall or trends on a platform, it's whether the energy survives the night. And as morning broke, stories emerged. Volunteers signing up for campaigns, donations surging, and grassroots leaders mobilizing watch parties into organizing circles. Harris's counterattack didn't just dismantle an opponent, it sparked contagion. Still, as the echo chamber intensified, one question remained unanswered. Could the powerful momentum of a single night be sustained through the grinding battles of a campaign? That suspense lingered. Because while Harris had undeniably seized the stage, the true test would be whether the tidal wave would hold or crash. As the debate wound down, the fervor still echoing in the hall, Kamala Harris moved. Beyond sparring lines and sound bites, she understood that the true victory in a moment like this wasn't just about defeating an opponent, it was about redefining the fight itself. So she lifted the conversation out of the mud DeSantis had dragged it toward and re-centered it on a truth much larger than either candidate. "Here's what this night is really about," she said, eyes steady into the camera. "It's about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to follow the politics of fear, of division, of telling some people they don't belong? Or do we want to keep building a nation that actually reflects our founding promise, that all people are created equal with the right to live and dream in dignity?" The hall erupted again, but this time the applause wasn't just for a sharp retort. It was for resonance. She wasn't speaking across the stage anymore. She was speaking across the nation. She invoked her mother's immigrant journey, the courage it took to step into a place that didn't always welcome newcomers with open arms, and the lessons she learned as a daughter of strivers scraping against the odds. "My story is possible," she reminded everyone, "because of the sacrifices of those who believed this country could be better than it was. And now it's our duty to make it better for those who come after us." For many watching, it was validation wrapped in inspiration. Harris had undone the insult hurled at her earlier, not merely by defending herself, but by weaving her dignity into a universal fabric. DeSantis had tried to make it personal, mocking her heritage, belittling her role. Instead, she made it national, turning her lived experience into proof of America's strength. In that moment, the debate no longer felt like a clash of two candidates, but a moral referendum. Cynicism or hope, exclusion or belonging, smallness or expansiveness. She offered not just rebuttal, but invitation to a vision of America capacious enough to hold multitudes without fear, and the crowd felt it. So did millions watching from their couches, workplaces, and phones. The message was clear. True strength isn't found in aggression or cruelty. It's found in the courage to stand tall without needing to belittle others. It's found in insisting that America lives up to its highest ideals, not its lowest impulses. The moderator closed the night and cameras began to fade. One truth lingered above everything that had been said. Kamala Harris had not just won an exchange. She had reclaimed the narrative, transformed an insult into inspiration, and reminded the nation of what it means to belong, not as fragments but as one people. And that, more than the cheers or the headlines, was the real mic drop. The argument ended, yet the lesson remained. America's story is at its strongest when it is shared by all. So there it was, the moment that lit up a debate stage flooded social media, and will be replayed for years to come. Kamala Harris delivering. He'd a takedown so sharp, so rooted in conviction that Ron DeSantis never recovered. The title told you what to expect. Kamala Harris destroys Ron DeSantis during explosive debate. Crowd erupts. But the reality was even more powerful. It wasn't just about a clash of candidates. It was about whose story defines America. What we witnessed wasn't luck, wasn't theatrics. It was the product of resilience forged in struggle and values anchored in dignity. Harris didn't simply rebuke an insult. She transformed the entire moment into proof that arrogance eventually unravels when met with composure and truth. And the eruption we heard from the crowd echoed beyond that hall because it was the sound of people choosing hope over hostility, inclusion over exclusion, vision over volume. That's the story worth carrying forward, because debates come and go, but the reminder remains. America, at its best, belongs to all of us, not just the loudest, not just the privileged, but every person who believes in its promise. If you felt the electricity of that moment, if you believe, like we do, that dignity should always outshine disdain, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with your friends, and join the movement to keep amplifying voices and values that bring people together rather than tear them apart. One debate, one eruption of truth, and one message we can never afford to forget. America does not belong to bullies. It belongs to the people.